Part 1. The strangest police situation I've ever experienced started in the most normal way possible. With a bag of groceries and a kid who thought everything in my hands belonged to him. I had just pulled into my driveway after a long shift and stepped out of the car carrying 2 heavy grocery bags. Before I even reached my front door, I heard a voice behind me say, "Hey, give me those." I turned around expecting maybe a joke from a neighbor, but instead there was a kid, maybe 12 or 13 years old, standing at the edge of my driveway with his arms crossed like he had just given me an order. At first I thought he was kidding, but when he pointed directly at the grocery bags and repeated, "My mom said you have to share," I realized this was going to be one of those days. Before we go further, if you enjoy crazy neighborhood drama and stories where entitled people push things way too far and regret it later, make sure to like the video and subscribe to Karen's Stories Daily. It really helps the channel grow, and we post stories like this all the time. Now I had only moved into this neighborhood a few months earlier. It's one of those suburban communities with neat lawns, quiet streets, and of course, a very active HOA. Most of the neighbors have been friendly enough so far. A few waves here, a couple casual conversations while checking the mail. Nothing unusual, but apparently one household had a reputation. The house directly across the street belonged to a woman everyone casually referred to as the Karen of the block. I didn't know her name yet, but I had heard small bits of gossip from neighbors who mentioned she argued with people about parking spots, trash bins, and even someone's Christmas lights. At the time I didn't think much of it, until the day her son demanded my groceries. So when the kid told me his mom said I had to share, I honestly thought he was joking. I smiled and said, "Nice try." But he didn't move. Instead, he stepped a little closer and pointed at the bags again. "My mom said neighbors are supposed to help us when we need food." Now that caught me off guard, because asking politely for help is one thing. Demanding someone's groceries like it's your right is something else entirely. I told him calmly, "These are my groceries." He shrugged and said, "We saw you bring them in last week too." I stood there for a second trying to understand what he meant. Then it clicked. They had been watching my grocery trips. The kid crossed his arms again and said something that made the situation even stranger. My mom said people with big houses can afford to share. Now at this point I was trying very hard not to laugh, because the confidence this kid had was unbelievable. I told him politely, "Go ask your mom to come talk to me if she needs something." He didn't move. Instead, he pointed at a cereal box sticking out of the grocery bag and said, "I want that one." That's when I finally shook my head and started walking toward my door. The kid shouted behind me, "I'm telling my mom." I assumed that would be the end of it. I was very wrong. About 5 minutes later, while I was putting groceries away in the kitchen, someone knocked on my door. When I opened it, the kid was standing there again, but this time his mother was right behind him. She had the classic HOA Karen posture, arms folded, chin raised slightly, and the expression of someone who already believed they were completely right. She didn't say hello. She pointed straight past me, toward the grocery bags on the kitchen counter. "My son said you refused to share food with him." The way she said it made it sound like I had broken some kind of law. I explained calmly that he had demanded groceries from a stranger's driveway. She shook her head like I had misunderstood something obvious. He asked politely. I almost laughed, because the version of events she was describing was not even close to what had happened. I told her again that if she needed help, she could ask respectfully. But that's when the conversation took a very strange turn. She stepped closer to the door and said something I still can't believe she thought made sense. "In this community, neighbors help each other." I nodded. "That's true." Then she pointed toward my kitchen again. "So give him the groceries." For a second I honestly thought she was joking, but the look on her face said she was completely serious. When I told her no, her entire expression changed. Her voice got louder. "My son said you have plenty." Now I've dealt with a lot of strange situations in my life, but this one was quickly climbing the list. I told her again that demanding groceries from neighbors wasn't acceptable. She turned to her son and said loudly, "See, some people don't believe in community." Then she looked back at me and said something that made the whole situation escalate instantly. "Maybe the police can explain it to you." I assumed that was just a dramatic comment. But 10 minutes later, I saw a patrol car turn onto our street. The Karen from across the street was standing in her yard with her arms crossed, watching the car pull up like she had just won an argument. And that's when the story took a turn she definitely didn't expect, because the officer stepping out of that patrol car knew exactly who I was. When the patrol car stopped in front of my house, the HOA Karen looked incredibly satisfied. She stood in her driveway with her arms crossed like she had just proven some important point to the entire neighborhood. A few other neighbors had already started peeking through their windows or stepping outside to see what was going on. Small suburban streets have a funny way of turning even small drama into a neighborhood event. The officer stepped out of the car and looked toward the houses for a moment. Then he saw me standing on my porch. For a second he looked confused. Then his face changed to a very different expression. He walked up the driveway and said, "Sir?" I nodded because the truth is, the Karen had absolutely no idea who she had just called the police on. I wasn't just another resident on the street. I was the local police chief. Now, before anyone imagines something dramatic, I don't go around announcing that to neighbors. When I moved into the neighborhood a few months earlier, I kept things simple. I introduced myself by first name, waved to people when they walked their dogs, and tried to live quietly like everyone else. Most people had no idea what I did for work. Apparently that included the HOA Karen. The officer who arrived recognized me immediately. He stood there for a second, clearly trying to understand what kind of situation he had just walked into. Behind him, the Karen stepped forward quickly. "Officer, thank you for coming," she said loudly. She pointed directly at me. "This man refused to help my child when he asked for food." The officer glanced at me again, then back at her. He asked calmly what exactly happened. She launched into a dramatic explanation about how her son had politely asked for groceries, and I had refused. While she was talking, the officer kept looking at me like he already suspected the story wasn't quite right. When she finished, he turned to me and asked if I wanted to explain. I simply told him what actually happened. Her son had walked into my driveway and demanded groceries. I suggested he ask his mother. She then came over and demanded them as well. That was it. No threats. No argument. Just a strange demand that turned into a police call. The officer looked at the Karen again. Then he asked her something very simple. "Did your son ask for food, or did he demand it?" She hesitated. That hesitation told the whole story. But the moment that really changed everything came next. Because the officer turned back to me and said, "Chief, do you want me to handle this?" The word chief hung in the air for a moment. The Karen's expression changed instantly. Her confident posture disappeared like someone had flipped a switch. She blinked a few times and looked between the officer and me. "Chief," she repeated quietly. The officer nodded slightly. "Yes, ma'am." You could practically see the moment she realized what had just happened. The person she had called the police on was the police chief. The silence that followed was almost painful. She tried to recover quickly. "Well, I didn't know that." I shrugged. "That doesn't really change the situation. Because the truth is, being the police chief wasn't even the important part. The real issue was the demand itself. Neighbors don't get to order groceries from each other." The officer calmly explained that calling police for something like this was not appropriate. He also explained that walking onto someone else's property to demand food could actually create its own problems. The Karen looked incredibly uncomfortable by this point. Her son was staring at the ground. After another minute of awkward silence, she mumbled something that sounded like an apology and quickly told her son to go back inside. They walked across the street without another word. The officer looked at me and shook his head slightly. "Interesting first call of the afternoon," he said. I laughed. "You have no idea." Over the next few weeks, the neighborhood seemed a little quieter. The Karen avoided eye contact whenever we happened to be outside at the same time. Her son stopped wandering into people's driveways, and apparently the story spread quickly through the neighborhood, because a few neighbors eventually stopped by to introduce themselves properly and apologize for the drama on the street. Sometimes situations like this are less about authority and more about simple boundaries. And that day, the Karen across the street learned a very simple one. Other people's groceries are not community property. If you enjoyed this story, let me know in the comments what you would have done in that situation. And if you know someone who deals with entitled neighbors like this, share this video with them. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to Karen Stories Daily.